The courtroom fell silent as Victoria Whitmore stood before Judge Patterson, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor with the confidence of someone who believed she'd already won the $500 million fortune left behind when Ryan's mom died just 3 months ago. She smiled that predatory smile, the same one she'd practiced in the mirror 1,000 times, certain that the grief-stricken 26-year-old sitting across from her was too broken to fight back. Ryan Mitchell sat motionless in his wheelchair, his Marine uniform still pressed despite everything he'd lost, his legs in combat, his mother to cancer, and now apparently his entire inheritance to the woman who'd spent the last year of his mom's life isolating her from her only son. But what Victoria didn't see was the sealed envelope Ryan had quietly handed Judge Patterson before she'd even entered the courtroom, an envelope that would transform her victory lap into the most humiliating moment of her entitled life. The judge's fingers drummed against that envelope now, his expression unreadable, as Victoria's lawyer began outlining why she deserved every penny of the fortune Ryan's mom had built. What was in that envelope that made the judge's jaw tighten? Why did Ryan look so calm when he was about to lose everything? And what had Victoria done that she was so desperately unaware of, something so devastating that it would shock her to her core in front of everyone? The fluorescent lights of the Los Angeles County Courthouse buzzed overhead as Ryan Mitchell wheeled himself through the hallway, each rotation of his chair's wheels echoing his mother's final words to him in that hospice room. "Promise me you'll fight for what's right, sweetheart. Not for the money, for what's right." Patricia Mitchell had whispered those words with tubes running through her frail arms, her once vibrant brown eyes dimmed by stage 4 pancreatic cancer, but still sharp enough to recognize the vulture circling her deathbed. Victoria Whitmore had been there too, of course, dabbing at dry eyes with a handkerchief, playing the role of devoted caretaker while checking her phone every 5 minutes. Ryan remembered the exact moment he'd known something was wrong. It was 14 months ago when he'd returned from Walter Reed Medical Center after losing both legs below the knee to an IED in Afghanistan. His mother had always called him every Sunday at 9 in the morning, Pacific time, without fail for his entire deployment. But suddenly the call stopped. When he'd finally gotten Victoria on the line, his mother's new friend, who'd moved into the Bel Air estate, he'd been told his mother was resting and didn't want to be disturbed. For 3 months, every call went to Victoria. Every email bounced back with an auto response that his mother had written, saying she needed space to process Ryan's injuries and would contact him when she was ready. That was a lie. His mother would never abandon him, especially not when he needed her most. Patricia Mitchell, the self-made tech mogul who'd built CloudSync Solutions from a garage startup to a $500 million empire, had raised Ryan alone after his father died when Ryan was 2. She'd been at every parent-teacher conference, every football game, every Medal of Honor ceremony when he'd saved his entire platoon. The idea that she'd suddenly ghost him was absurd. It took a phone call from Patricia's oncologist, Dr. Sarah Chen, to break through Victoria's wall. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm violating patient confidentiality because I took an oath to do no harm," the doctor had said, her voice shaking. "Your mother has been asking for you every single day. She thinks you don't want to see her because of what happened to your legs. Someone's been telling her you're ashamed and want nothing to do with her anymore." Ryan had caught the next flight from D.C. to LAX, bursting into his childhood home to find his mother in a hospital bed in what used to be the library, surrounded by medical equipment and, notably, completely isolated from her phone, her computer, and any means of outside communication. "Ryan," Patricia's face had crumpled when she saw him, "they told me you never wanted to see me again. They said you blamed me for not stopping you from enlisting." He'd held her hand, felt how thin she'd become, and realized with cold clarity that Victoria had orchestrated the entire separation. The woman had moved in under the guise of being a life coach Patricia had hired during a corporate retreat in Sedona. Within weeks, she'd installed herself as Patricia's assistant, then her health advocate, then her power of attorney when Patricia's diagnosis came. And through it all, she'd been systematically cutting Ryan out of his mother's life, feeding Patricia lies about her son's supposed resentment, while telling Ryan his mother wanted distance. Now, sitting outside courtroom 4C, Ryan opened his worn leather messenger bag and pulled out a stack of documents he'd spent the last 3 months assembling. His mother had lived for 6 weeks after their reunion, weeks where Victoria had suddenly become saccharine sweet, probably realizing her manipulation had been exposed. But Patricia Mitchell was dying, and there were medical decisions to be made, and Victoria still held that power of attorney. Ryan had watched helplessly as Victoria made choices that seemed designed to maximize Patricia's suffering while minimizing costs, rejecting palliative care options, insisting on the cheapest hospice facility until Ryan threatened legal action, controlling who could visit and when. The worst part was the will. 2 weeks before Patricia died, Victoria had brought an attorney to the hospice, not the family lawyer who'd handled Patricia's affairs for 20 years, but some slick operator from a strip mall office in Van Nuys. Ryan had been blocked from that meeting, told it was private legal business. When Patricia died and the will was read, Ryan discovered that his mother had allegedly changed everything. The revised will left the entire $500 million cloud sync fortune to Victoria Whitmore, with Ryan receiving a modest trust fund of $50,000 a year to support his disability needs. The language was cold, clinical, nothing like his mother's voice. Victoria's lawyer, Gerald Hutchins, emerged from the courtroom now, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his $1,000 suit pressed within an inch of its life. "Mr. Mitchell," he said with faux sympathy, "there's still time to settle this reasonably. Accept the trust fund, sign the release, and we can all avoid the unpleasantness of a trial. Your mother made her wishes clear. Fighting them only tarnishes her memory." Ryan looked up at the man who'd probably coached Victoria through every step of this con. "My mother's wishes were crystal clear, Mr. Hutchins. That's exactly why we're here." The lawyer's smile tightened. "Grief makes people irrational. Judge Patterson is fair, but he follows the law. A properly executed will is very difficult to overturn, especially when you're alleging undue influence against a woman who dedicated herself to your mother's care." "We'll see," Ryan said quietly. What Gerald Hutchins didn't know was that Ryan had spent 12 weeks doing what Marines do best: reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. He'd tracked down every person who'd interacted with his mother in that final year. He'd found the real estate agent who'd sold Victoria a $3.2 million condo in Miami, purchased 8 months before Patricia died, paid in cash, despite Victoria claiming to be a struggling life coach making $40,000 a year. He'd discovered Victoria's previous identities: Victoria Russo in Phoenix, where she'd befriended an elderly widow who died mysteriously and left her entire estate to Victoria before the woman's children could intervene. Before that, she'd been Victoria Chen in Seattle, companion to a retired Microsoft executive who changed his will 2 weeks before a fatal fall down his staircase. Ryan had brought all of it to the FBI, but financial exploitation of the elderly moved slowly through federal bureaucracy. The civil case was faster. And Ryan had one more piece of evidence, something he'd kept close to his chest, something Victoria had no idea existed. His mother, in one of her final lucid moments, had asked him to bring her a phone. Not her regular phone, which Victoria monitored, but a burner he'd bought at a gas station. Patricia had recorded a video, 12 minutes of her, stating clearly that she was of sound mind, that Victoria had isolated her from Ryan through lies and manipulation, that she'd never intended to leave her fortune to anyone but her son, and that she feared Victoria was controlling her medication to keep her confused and compliant during legal meetings. That video was in the envelope Ryan had given Judge Patterson this morning. The bailiff opened the courtroom doors. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Christopher Patterson." Ryan wheeled himself to the plaintiff's table, positioning himself across from Victoria, who sat with perfect posture in a black Chanel suit, playing the grieving widow despite never having been married to Patricia. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Ryan saw it, the flash of contempt she couldn't quite hide. She thought she'd won. She had no idea what was coming. Judge Patterson, a 63-year-old former prosecutor with a reputation for seeing through BS, settled into his chair and opened the file. His eyes flicked to Ryan, then to the envelope sitting prominently on his desk, then to Victoria. "This is a case to contest the last will and testament of Patricia Ann Mitchell, deceased. Mr. Mitchell, you're representing yourself?" "Yes, Your Honor," Ryan said. "I couldn't afford an attorney after spending everything on my mother's real medical care." He let that sink in, watching Victoria's jaw tighten. Ms. Whitmore, you're represented by Mr. Hutchins. I've reviewed the filings. This will be an evidentiary hearing to determine whether undue influence was exercised over the deceased. Mr. Mitchell, you may present your opening statement. Ryan couldn't stand, but his voice carried across the courtroom with the clarity of someone who'd given orders under fire. Your Honor, my mother built a $500 million company through brilliance, hard work, and integrity. She loved me more than anything in this world, and I loved her. The woman sitting across from me isolated my mother, lied to both of us to keep us apart, manipulated a dying woman's fear and confusion, and orchestrated the theft of my mother's life's work. I'm not here for the money. I'm here because my mother asked me to fight for what's right, and I have evidence that will prove beyond any doubt exactly what Victoria Whitmore did. Victoria's lawyer shot to his feet. Objection. These are inflammatory accusations without... Mr. Hutchins, Judge Patterson said calmly, this is an opening statement. Sit down. He turned to Ryan. Continue. The envelope I gave you this morning contains a video my mother recorded 6 days before she died. She was lucid, she was clear, and she explained everything. But that's not all I have. Ryan pulled out the first document from his stack, and somewhere in the back of her mind, Victoria Whitmore began to realize that maybe, just maybe, she'd underestimated the grieving Marine in the wheelchair. The video played on the courtroom screen, and Patricia Mitchell's voice filled the room like a ghost delivering testimony from beyond the grave. She looked directly into the camera, her face gaunt but her eyes sharp, and she spoke with the precision of someone who knew this might be her last act of protection for her son. My name is Patricia Ann Mitchell. Today is October 14th, and I am recording this of my own free will and sound mind. I want to state clearly that I never intended to disinherit my son, Ryan Patrick Mitchell. The will that Victoria Whitmore had drawn up is not reflective of my wishes and was created under duress and manipulation. Victoria's face had gone pale, her perfectly applied makeup suddenly looking like a mask. Gerald Hutchins was frantically scribbling notes, but Ryan could see the lawyer's confidence evaporating in real time. Patricia continued, Victoria Whitmore entered my life 18 months ago at a corporate retreat. She presented herself as a life coach and wellness expert. What I didn't know until recently was that she'd researched me extensively, knew about my company's valuation, and targeted me specifically. The video showed Patricia pausing to catch her breath, the oxygen tube in her nose a stark reminder of her condition. Within 3 months of meeting her, Victoria had moved into my home, convinced me to make her my assistant, and began controlling my communications. She told me my son Ryan was ashamed of his relationship with me after his injury in Afghanistan. She showed me fake emails that appeared to be from him, saying he blamed me for not stopping him from enlisting, that he couldn't bear to see me. I was devastated. I was also starting chemotherapy, and Victoria controlled my medications. I now believe she was giving me extra doses of anxiety medication and pain medication that left me confused and suggestible. Judge Patterson's expression had hardened into something carved from granite. He glanced at Victoria, who was whispering urgently to her attorney. On the screen, Patricia wiped tears from her eyes. When Ryan finally broke through and visited me, I realized the truth. Victoria had fabricated everything. She'd isolated me from my son during the worst time of both our lives. But by then, I was dying, and she had power of attorney. The attorney she brought to create the new will worked for her, not for me. I was heavily medicated during that meeting. I don't remember signing anything, but they tell me I did. The camera moved slightly as Patricia leaned forward. If something happens to me and that will stands, please know it wasn't my choice. Ryan is my whole heart. Everything I built was for him. Victoria Whitmore is a con artist and a predator, and I'm recording this because I'm afraid she might... Patricia's voice broke. I'm afraid she might speed things along once the will is signed. My doctor says I have weeks or months left, but Victoria keeps pushing for higher morphine doses, and I wake up confused, not knowing what day it is. The video ended with Patricia saying, I love you, Ryan. Fight for what's right, baby. Always fight for what's right. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of Victoria's sharp breathing. Judge Patterson set down his pen and looked at her with undisguised disgust. Miss Whitmore, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I remind you that you're under oath. Did you isolate Patricia Mitchell from her son through deception? Victoria's mouth opened and closed. Gerald Hutchins put a hand on her arm, whispering, "Don't answer that." But the damage was done. The judge had seen the video, and everyone in that courtroom knew the truth. Ryan pulled out his next document, a timeline he'd constructed showing every text message, every blocked call, every manipulated interaction. He'd subpoenaed phone records, email servers, everything. The paper trail was devastating. "Your Honor," Ryan said, "I have testimony from Dr. Sarah Chen, my mother's oncologist, about medication irregularities. I have financial records showing Miss Whitmore purchased a $3.2 million property while supposedly caring for my dying mother on a life coach's salary. I have evidence of her previous identities in similar cons in Arizona and Washington. And I have this." He held up a photograph. "This is Victoria Whitmore with my mother's estate attorney, Martin Broussard, the real attorney who handled my mother's affairs for 2 decades, taken 3 weeks before my mother died. Mr. Broussard will testify that my mother asked him to come to the hospice to change her will back to its original form, leaving everything to me. But when he arrived, Victoria turned him away, claiming my mother was too medicated to make legal decisions. 2 days later, Victoria's strip mall lawyer showed up instead. Gerald Hutchins was standing now, his face red. "Your Honor, this is hearsay and conjecture. My client devoted herself to—" But Judge Patterson cut him off with a raised hand. The judge's eyes were locked on Victoria, and his voice was ice. "Counselor, sit down before I hold you in contempt. Ms. Whitmore, based on what I've seen and heard this morning, I'm issuing an immediate injunction freezing all assets of the Patricia Mitchell estate pending a full investigation." The revelation hit Victoria like a physical blow, and Ryan watched her carefully constructed facade crack down the middle. But he wasn't done. Not even close. What happened next would expose not just the con, but the depth of Victoria's depravity. Ryan wheeled himself to the evidence table and retrieved a manila folder he'd kept separate from everything else. "Your Honor, there's something else. Something that goes beyond financial exploitation." The judge's eyebrows rose. "Proceed, Mr. Mitchell." Ryan opened the folder with steady hands, though his heart was racing. Inside were medical records, pharmacy logs, and a toxicology report that had cost him $15,000 of his own money to obtain through a private lab. "After my mother died, I requested an autopsy. The hospice initially refused, but I pushed. What they found was—" He paused, making sure every word landed. "Elevated levels of morphine and lorazepam consistent with overdose, not palliative care. My mother died 3 weeks earlier than her oncologist predicted, and she died during the 4-hour window when I was required to leave the hospice because of Victoria's family time restrictions." The courtroom erupted. Gerald Hutchins was shouting objections. Victoria had gone from pale to gray, and Judge Patterson was banging his gavel. "Order! I will have order!" The judge turned to Ryan. "Mr. Mitchell, are you alleging what I think you're alleging?" "I'm alleging that Victoria Whitmore murdered my mother to secure the inheritance before I could challenge the will," Ryan said, his voice steady despite the rage burning in his chest. "The medical examiner's report notes suspicious circumstances, but stops short of declaring it homicide because hospice deaths are rarely investigated. I'm requesting this court order a full criminal investigation." Victoria finally found her voice, shrill and desperate. "This is insane. I loved Patricia. I took care of her when her own son abandoned her." But her words rang hollow against the mountain of evidence Ryan had built. Judge Patterson held up the toxicology report, reading it carefully. Ryan had highlighted the relevant sections. Morphine levels 3 times higher than prescribed, administered through Patricia's IV during the time when Victoria had been alone with her. "There's more," Ryan continued, pulling out another document. "I tracked down the night nurse who was on duty when my mother died. Victoria sent her home early that night, saying she wanted private time to say goodbye. The nurse, Emma Rodriguez, will testify that Victoria insisted on being alone with my mother, despite hospice policy requiring medical staff present. When Nurse Rodriguez returned 2 hours later, my mother was dead. Victoria claimed she'd passed peacefully, but the morphine pump showed manual override inputs that only someone with medical knowledge could execute. How would Ms. Whitmore have medical knowledge? Judge Patterson asked. Ryan had been waiting for this question, because Victoria Whitmore was a registered nurse in Florida until 2019, when her license was suspended for medication theft from patients. She changed her name and moved west, reinventing herself as a life coach. But she knew exactly how to manipulate my mother's medications, how to keep her confused and compliant, and how to, his voice caught, how to end her life when the will was safely changed. The evidence kept coming. Testimony from other hospice workers who'd noticed Victoria's controlling behavior. Security footage showing Victoria carrying her own syringes into the hospice. Pharmacy records of controlled substances that didn't match Patricia's prescriptions. Ryan had spent 3 months building an airtight case, using every investigative skill the Marines had taught him. He'd gone through his mother's financial records and found payments to Victoria's consulting business that totaled over $200,000 in the months before Patricia's death. Money Victoria had supposedly earned through wellness coaching, but was actually systematic theft disguised as legitimate business expenses. Gerald Hutchins was in full damage control mode now, whispering urgently to Victoria, who looked like she might vomit. The lawyer stood, his composure cracking. Your Honor, these accusations are slanderous and without merit. My client denies any wrongdoing and... Judge Patterson silenced him with a look. Mr. Hutchins, your client is about to be arrested. I suggest you save your arguments for criminal court. He turned to the bailiff. Contact the district attorney's office immediately. I want detectives here within the hour. Ryan felt a grim satisfaction as Victoria's world collapsed around her. But there was still one more piece of evidence, one final nail in the coffin that would ensure she spent the rest of her life in prison. He pulled out a small recording device. Your Honor, 6 weeks ago, I visited Victoria at her new Miami condo. I was wearing a wire. I asked her about my mother's final days, and she made certain admissions that I believe constitute a confession. He played the recording. Victoria's voice came through clearly. Your mother was in pain, Ryan. I did her a favor by helping her along. She would have suffered for weeks otherwise. You should be thanking me. On the recording, Ryan's voice responded, You killed her for the money. And Victoria, thinking she'd already won, thinking the will was ironclad and Ryan was just a broken veteran she could manipulate, had laughed. The money's mine now. Patricia wanted me to have it. She told me so herself when I gave her that last dose. She said, Take care of yourself, Victoria. And I am. The courtroom was dead silent. Victoria lunged across the table, screaming, That's not what I meant. You twisted my words. I was speaking metaphorically. But everyone knew the truth. Judge Patterson stood, his face a mask of controlled fury. Victoria Whitmore, I am placing you under immediate arrest for suspicion of murder. Bailiff, detain her. As Victoria was handcuffed, still screaming denials, the judge turned to Ryan. Mr. Mitchell, I am nullifying the contested will, effective immediately and restoring the original testament. Your mother's estate will be returned to you in full. I am also ordering a criminal investigation into Ms. Whitmore's previous cases in Arizona and Washington. If there are other victims, we will find them. Ryan sat in his wheelchair, watching Victoria being dragged from the courtroom, and felt his mother's presence like a hand on his shoulder. He'd fought for what was right, just like she'd asked. The money didn't matter, though he'd use it to fund veteran services and cancer research in his mother's name. What mattered was justice. What mattered was that Patricia Mitchell's killer wouldn't profit from her murder. 3 months later, Ryan sat in the same courtroom for Victoria Whitmore's criminal trial. The prosecution had built an even stronger case than Ryan's civil suit, uncovering 2 previous deaths connected to Victoria, the widow in Phoenix and the Microsoft executive in Seattle. Both had died suspiciously after changing their wills in Victoria's favor, and both had exhibited signs of morphine overdose. The FBI had gotten involved, and Victoria was facing 3 counts of first-degree murder, plus a litany of fraud and exploitation charges that would keep her in prison for life, even if the murder charges somehow didn't stick. Ryan had testified for 4 hours, walking the jury through his mother's final year, the systematic isolation, the manipulation, the theft, and finally the murder. He'd shown them the video Patricia had recorded, played the confession from Miami, and presented the medical evidence. The defense had tried to paint him as a bitter son, angry about being disinherited, but that narrative collapsed when Ryan's military records were entered into evidence. 3 Purple Hearts, a Silver Star, and testimony from his commanding officer about his character and integrity. The defense had also tried to suggest that Patricia's cancer had simply progressed faster than expected, that the morphine levels were consistent with end-stage palliative care, and that Victoria's recorded statements were taken out of context. But the prosecution had brought in Dr. Michael Torres, a leading forensic pathologist, who'd reviewed every medical record and testified unequivocally that Patricia Mitchell had been murdered. The morphine levels in her system were not consistent with standard hospice protocols, Dr. Torres explained to the jury. Someone manually overrode the pump and administered a lethal dose. The timing, during the window when medical staff were absent and only Miss Whitmore was present, is not coincidental. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Victoria's defense team brought in their own experts, tried to discredit Ryan's investigation, and even attempted to suppress the video Patricia had recorded by claiming she'd been too medicated to consent to being filmed. But every argument fell flat against the weight of evidence. The jury saw Victoria for what she was, a calculating predator who'd hunted vulnerable, wealthy people, ingratiated herself into their lives, isolated them from their loved ones, and ultimately killed them for their money. Ryan had also helped the prosecution connect with the families of Victoria's previous victims. Margaret Henderson's children in Phoenix had suspected foul play, but couldn't prove it. Now they were watching the trial with the same grim satisfaction Ryan felt. Thomas Chen's daughter in Seattle broke down crying when she learned that her father's death was finally being investigated as murder. Victoria had left a trail of devastated families across 3 states, and they'd all come to watch her face justice. The moment of verdict was almost anticlimactic. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. 3 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of fraud, financial exploitation, and forgery. As the verdicts were read, Victoria showed no emotion. The mask she'd worn so successfully was now permanently frozen in place. Judge Patterson, presiding over the criminal trial just as he had the civil case, didn't hesitate in sentencing. Victoria Whitmore, you are a remorseless predator who targeted vulnerable people in their final days. You exploited their trust, stole their wealth, and murdered them when they became inconvenient to your plans. I hereby sentence you to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Ryan watched her being led away in chains and felt something release in his chest. Not quite peace, but close to it. His mother could rest now. Justice had been served. He wheeled himself out of the courtroom into the bright Los Angeles sunshine, where reporters were waiting with cameras and questions. He gave a brief statement about his mother's legacy, about the importance of protecting elderly and vulnerable people from predators, and about his plans to donate the majority of his inheritance to causes his mother had cared about. That night, back in the Bel Air house that now legally belonged to him, Ryan sat in his mother's home office, surrounded by photos of them together. His graduation from boot camp, her retirement party from Cloud Sync, the 2 of them at his Medal of Honor ceremony, with her beaming proudly beside him in his wheelchair. He'd won the battle she'd asked him to fight, but the victory felt hollow without her there to share it. Still, he could almost hear her voice. You did good, baby. You fought for what was right. 6 months after Victoria's sentencing, Ryan actually stood on his new prosthetic legs at the dedication of the Patricia Mitchell Center for Elder Advocacy, a nonprofit he'd founded with $50 million of the inheritance. The center would provide free legal services to families fighting financial exploitation, fund investigations into suspicious deaths of elderly people, and train social workers to recognize the warning signs of predatory caregivers. Ryan had recruited some of the country's best elder law attorneys, forensic accountants, and victim advocates to staff the center, and they'd already taken on 30 cases in California alone. The media coverage of Victoria's trial had sparked a national conversation about elder abuse and the vulnerabilities of wealthy people facing terminal illness. Several states had introduced legislation requiring stricter oversight of power of attorney arrangements and mandatory reporting of suspicious changes to wills. Ryan had testified before Congress about his mother's case, helping to shape federal protections for elderly Americans. It was the kind of legacy his mother would have wanted, her death leading to changes that would protect others. Ryan's personal life had found a new rhythm too. He'd reconnected with his Marine buddies, several of whom were dealing with their own struggles, adapting to civilian life after combat injuries. He'd started a support group that met weekly at the center, a space where veterans could talk about the challenges of disability, loss, and finding purpose after service. It reminded him why he'd enlisted in the first place, to protect people, to serve something larger than himself. His mother had understood that calling had supported him even when she'd been terrified of losing him. The inheritance had allowed Ryan to fund not just the center, but also a partnership with Walter Reed to develop better prosthetics for wounded veterans. He donated $25 million to pancreatic cancer research at UCLA, where his mother had been treated. Another $10 million went to scholarship funds for children of fallen service members. CloudSync Solutions, which he now owned, was being run by the management team his mother had built, with Ryan serving as chairman and using the company's resources to promote ethical business practices and employee welfare. But perhaps the most meaningful project was the one he kept private, a scholarship program for children who'd lost parents to financial exploitation or elder abuse. He'd met so many families during Victoria's trial, people who'd been bankrupted by con artists, who'd lost not just their parents but their inheritances and their sense of justice. Ryan's fund would help their children get education and opportunities despite the devastation their families had faced. It was a small thing in the grand scheme, but it mattered. On the anniversary of his mother's death, Ryan visited her grave at Forest Lawn Memorial Park. He brought her favorite flowers, white roses, and sat beside the headstone for a long time, just talking to her the way he used to during their Sunday phone calls. He told her about the center, about the lives they were saving, about the legislation that was passing because of her story. He told her about the nightmares he still had sometimes, about the rage he'd felt during the trial, about how he was learning to channel that anger into something productive. "I miss you, Mom," he said finally, touching the cool marble of her headstone. "Every single day. But I think you'd be proud of what we're building. Victoria's in prison where she belongs, and we're making sure what happened to you doesn't happen to other families. I fought for what was right, just like you asked, and I'm going to keep fighting." The sun was setting over the Hollywood Hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that his mother had always loved. Ryan stood on his prosthetics, still unsteady, still learning, but standing nonetheless, and saluted the woman who'd given him everything: life, love, values, and a legacy worth protecting. Patricia Mitchell had been more than a tech mogul or a fortune or a name on a company. She'd been a mother who'd taught her son the difference between right and wrong, who'd shown him that strength meant standing up for the vulnerable, and who'd trusted him to carry on her work even from beyond the grave. Victoria Whitmore had thought she could steal that legacy through manipulation and murder. She'd underestimated the bond between a mother and son, the power of truth, and the determination of a Marine who'd been asked to fight one last battle. Now she was spending the rest of her life in a cell, while Patricia Mitchell's legacy lived on through the lives saved by the center. The veterans helped by Ryan's programs, and the families protected by the laws her case had inspired. In the end, love and justice had won, and Ryan knew without any doubt that his mother was at peace.